Hello and welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. I'm Joe Devine and I'm joined today by JJ Bull. Yes, hello. JJ and I are delighted to be joined for this special episode of the podcast by Dan Pelchen, a data scientist working in recruitment in football and the creator of Player Traits. Hello, Dan. How are you?
Very well, thank you, Joe.
Thanks for joining us today. We're very excited to talk about scouting. It's one of the things we enjoy talking about.
I like it a lot, yes.
Well, it's one of the most fun things about football, isn't it? Yeah.
It's one of the things I like doing, but I'm not a professional. Well, I suppose technically sort of.
Sure.
But not like Dan. So
yeah, there we go. Well, Dan, on that note, will you tell us a little bit about your background? Who the hell are you and why are you here?
Okay, so, well, I'm an Aussie. You've probably picked that one up already, but basically I'm a data scientist, as you say. And what I did is I've come from an Aussie Rules football background. Not sure if you know too much about Australian rules football.
Will you tell us a tiny bit about it anyway? Because just for the listeners at home that don't know.
I know all about it, yeah.
Well, so do I.
Tell them.
Some listeners might not.
Okay, so for the listeners at home, it's a manic sport in terms of the amount of things that are going on at any given time. There's 18 players on a cricket field at any given time. For each team. And basically what they're doing is they're punting a ball all around this big oval, trying to get the ball from one end to another. So imagine 18 goalkeepers per side playing with an oval-shaped ball where they're allowed to tackle each other as well.
Sure.
So
it sounds really stupid when you describe it like that, but then I'm imagining someone describing football to someone who's never seen it before. 11 people kicking a ball around, trying to get it in a hole. It also sounds stupid, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, lots of sports do.
Sure. Anyway, sorry, carry on.
Anyway, so Aussie Rules, it's an interesting place from a data perspective, which is really the area that I work in, because there is so much going on at any given time with that many players on a pitch and a ball buzzing around and all of them having a different amount of touches of the ball and doing different things with it. And compared to, say, some of the North American sports like baseball, where analytics might be really well understood with these very distinct exchanges, what's unique about Aussie Rules football is just how much chaos there is going on at any given time. So having numbers to actually support your understanding of that and coaches' understanding of that is really an interesting place to work. So that's where I worked for 5 years in Aussie Rules football at a club called Collingwood Football Club.
Can I ask a question just at this point before we carry on? I am sort of given to understand that like one of the reasons it's easier to use data to analyze some American sports is because of the sort of stop-start nature of them, like with baseball as a really good example, or basketball where the intervals of play are much more brief versus something like football or Aussie Rules where there's a lot happening, it's very fluid and it's hard to use metrics to describe that when there's a more fluidity in the sport itself.
That's it. Yeah, spot on. So basically the more dynamic and the more complex the sport in terms of how many people are moving around and all of that, the harder it is generally to measure because there's the exchange that's happening at any given time is much more complex. So that's why data is valuable in trying to understand that complexity. But in terms of how that actually works within an Aussie Rules football sense, but also in a football sense, being able to capture the context of what it is that you're measuring at any given time is what becomes really important. So for me in Aussie Rules working in there was a really good landscape because it is chaos, but it's organised chaos. So the coaches and the scouts and the people in Aussie Rules, they have this really strong appetite for the numbers because it's got quite a rich cultural background in the sport in terms of trying to make sense of everything that's going on. So for me, I was a data-specific analyst working at Collingwood Football Club, and my role was spread across both the recruitment department in doing talent ID and player profiling toward the draft that we have in Aussie Rules football. And then the other half of my role was working in the performance analysis department alongside the coaches and other analysts in doing a preview for a match, working live on a match day, and then a review afterward.
How have you gone then from doing that Australian rules football, or Aussie? Is it Australian rules or is it Aussie Rules? Is it Aussie Rules?
It could be Aussie Rules, yeah.
So you gone from there. How did you go from there to then working for Premier League clubs and elite level clubs?
Yeah, very good question. So basically, when I was at Collingwood for the 5 years there, I also did a PhD in human resource analytics throughout that time. And
so you're Dr. Dan.
Dr. Dan.
We should have said Dr.
Technically, I don't advertise that one too much, but Dr. Dan. So basically I did a PhD, which was, the title of it was Quantifying Draft Value in Prospective AFL Draftees. So taking everything we know about footballers at a draft age, both on and off the pitch, and reducing it down to something that can be really easily understood by domain experts. So taking huge amounts of data and reducing it down. But through the PhD, I was lucky enough to go to a number of different conferences in Australia and abroad, but one of those was over here in the UK, and I was able to meet with a few different clubs, and one of those was Chelsea at the time. And when they saw the work that I was doing with event data and how that was being sort of translated to football language, they were quite interested and basically said, Dan, look, it'd be interesting if you came and did some of this work with us, and how would you like to have a go at it? To which I said, absolutely.
And then at Chelsea, just for context for everyone, you came in at quite a high level, but by the time you left there, you were at a very high level at your...
Not necessarily. In terms of where I came in, I think I started as a contractor, really. So to begin with, they basically said, look, the brief is basically add value with our data, do what you did on Aussie Rules. We know you've done some cool work. Good luck. And that.
So did these give you like the data they already had for you to work with and to make sense of it, or did you then help compile?
No, more the former. So basically it was like, we have all this data. We're using it quite heavily, like from a recruitment perspective. We're doing it a lot in terms of looking at, players that are out there, but we're using all of these statistics in terms of the numbers that are available to us. Whereas I guess what I do with traits specifically is taking all of that granular data and translating it into something that's probably more in line with the way that, again, football people understand the game. So what I was doing was taking the raw statistics, the granular statistics, and deriving other numbers from it, and really reducing it and putting it into such a way where people can actually understand it in plain football language. So the way that that's done is obviously going to be different from one position to the next, but it was understanding football first of all. That was kind of my brief initially, to come into the club and start learning the environment, because again, Aussie Rules is very different to global football. So
how did you do that? I mean, because it's quite a weird thing, isn't it, to move from one sport to another? Like what? I'm sure you had seen football before.
Yeah.
But like, how do you approach trying to understand a different sport? Like, do you look for where the differences are or where the slightly different nuances are?
Yeah. Good question. And I think the guys at Chelsea, they were really supportive of me sort of taking my time to actually understand that landscape and environment. So to begin with, I was brought in and they sort of gave me quite a bit of time saying, look, here's the data. And I was working alongside some of the analysts to understand just what their role looked like. And I was able to sort of shadow and observe them and seeing the way that they did things. And then after a bit of time of basically watching a number of games of football at different levels and being able to sort of understand that the way that coaches were communicating football, players were communicating football, analysts were communicating football, I started to get an appreciation for the way that things were being done and
how it's all
could
different
be done
in all of those different examples, right?
That's it. So effectively what I did was like sort of get to understand the lay of the land, and then was able to apply the type of modeling that I did to the data that was available. So basically that was working again with the analyst to begin with, to basically say, all right, what is it that we're looking to measure, and let's go and measure it. And we built out a prototype of a traits model for them. And then what happened after time is, once we'd sort of delivered the prototype, proved the value, they were like, okay, there's something in this. And at that point is when they got a number of different people from all the different departments. So there was representation from the first team, the loans department, the recruitment department, and the academy. And they all basically said, look, how is it that we want to use this data to measure a player's profile? And let's do it in such a way where we're all agreeing on the language, we're all agreeing on the inputs, and then therefore we can agree on how the data is interpreted moving forward in plain football language, as opposed to using these hundreds or thousands of data points, which in isolation can be very tricky to navigate.
I think that's the interesting thing about it for me. You mentioned before all of the different, stakeholders involved in these decisions, particularly at big football clubs. But it always surprises me when I meet people from football clubs or hear about them, their different levels of like data literacy, for example. And I think it is probably still the case that most of the senior decision makers at many, even Premier League football clubs, probably don't have a grasp of the data in anywhere near the same way that the data scientists working there do. They will talk about it just in terms of the language that they use in a completely different way to the way that you might talk about it with one of your colleagues. So presumably the communication gap is a big, or can be a big problem at clubs like this, trying to help people understand what something actually means.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's not a problem that's isolated to football. That's true of really every industry everywhere, being able to bridge the gap between
politics,
between technical data scientists and data language versus domain expertise. And I think that's really the place that I've always worked in my career, where I've been, again, fortunate in Aussie Rules to be in a place where the coaches and domain experts have this really big appetite for data. But over in football, when I came here, I'd say that culturally it's probably not at the same level in terms of just saying we want the numbers all the time.
Maybe not in Europe, right? In America, it feels slightly different because of the, I guess, like the different sports that they have over there. Over here as well, you find that even clubs that you might describe as data led or like having a significant portion of that, they still have like football people in positions of where they can make important decisions.
Yeah.
Sometimes from an external perspective, it seems like there's a bit of a clash between those two ideologies, or at least even like to take it back a step further, even in journalism, which is like the world that we exist in, you might identify people who are like, oh, that's a data writer, or they're like a tactics person, or they're like more of a football person. And there are divisions still. I would have thought that like the way you would want it to work at the top of a very big team is seamlessly, where there isn't a division between those two things, and it's all just discussed in the same language.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really where everyone's trying to get to, or should be trying to get to, in making sure that there's a collective understanding of the way that the data is being interpreted, whether you're a coach, a scout, an analyst, a player themselves. It's making sure that there's that collective understanding. But in order to get there, that's not putting really advanced metrics in a very sort of complex technical language in front of them. It's reducing that complex data into something that on the front end is very easy to understand and quite interpretable, where you don't need an analyst to actually drive the analysis. You can put it in the hands of a decision maker and have the trust and faith that they can navigate it and understand the outputs without necessarily having to ask all these different questions. And what that does is it makes for a really good objective conversation where you don't have to wait for 3 hours, 3 days, 3 weeks to have analysis turned around. It basically is something that they can use and interpret at their fingertips. So, yeah.
So the things you would then be preparing to, so I'm trying to work out what the process would be here. So in a well-run club, you'd have like the managers managing the players, whatever, and maybe the recruitment department, which would work depending on largely what the sporting director maybe, or what the manager was looking for. So, have in the past, you provided things as they said, we need to get someone to play left back, say, we need to get someone to play strikers, but strikers? You need to play someone to play strikers.
Two strikers.
Two strikers.
This was 1995.
We need two strikers, yeah. So you've then developed a database, or at Chelsea or wherever data analysts are working, they prepare a database so they can identify players that will suit the style of play the certain manager will have. Is that the sort of thing you can do? So you can tell who might fit before scouting begins. Is that how it works?
No, absolutely. So going back to like how we can actually bridge that gap between the domain experts and the technical experts, what I do is basically making sure that the way that the domain experts, are understanding football is being captured. And the way in which you do that is working with them to understanding what it is that they actually want measured in the first place. So that's using the example we had earlier, that was what was done at Chelsea, and basically saying, how is it that you want to measure a footballer? What is it that we're communicating? And then let's go and measure it. And we're building out this framework of understanding each of the different components to a player's game and then quantifying it. And the way that that's being modeled is going to be different from a centre forward or a striker to how it is for a winger versus a fullback versus a midfielder versus a defensive midfielder and so on. But in what I do, again, in making sure that it's actually landing with the decision makers who ultimately need to be using it, is making sure that it's tailored and bespoke for each individual club. So the way that a framework might work at a Man City versus how it would work at a Liverpool versus how it would work at a Chelsea versus how it would work at a Burnley is going to be different in each instance, because they've got different values in what their football philosophy ultimately is. So
there's something quite fundamental about that, though. I mean, like I think that's hard to accept, not just from a football perspective, if you work in a football club, but for anybody, that there is no universal truth. Like that's essentially what you're saying, right? Is there isn't one number which can account for this player for every team. There might be 8 different numbers for 8 different teams. And when we think about, put this in terms that we would understand, we play FIFA or Football Manager or whatever, it doesn't matter which club you're managing, the players' traits and the ratings are the same.
Yeah.
And that's one universal truth. Whereas the conversation we're having here is that is not the case. It's quite difficult, I think, for some people to accept, because football is about, or has always been about, trying to be the best, right?
Yeah.
Having a kind of binary understanding of what the best is okay, the team that wins the most titles, well, that's the same number, regardless of which team you are. It's Man United that have got the most or whatever. You want the best striker. Let's say that's Harry Kane or Erling Haaland. It doesn't matter which team you are. He's the best striker. It doesn't matter if he's not the best striker for you. Like, that mindset is really locked in place. It certainly is for me. So like getting to the point where you're thinking about what's best for your club, and that might not be the best thing for another club. It takes some of the, I don't know, it's like some of the severity of that dynamic out of it a little bit. It's quite hard. You find it's hard for people to make that transition?
No, to be honest, I think that's been what's really positive about some of the work that I've done, is that people and domain experts in particular see the opportunity to actually put their stamp on what the analysis is saying and how it's coming out. So I think if you look at football culturally, what I've seen in the past is that there is a lot of sort of speculation around the value of data, because it doesn't always align with the way that these domain experts understand football. But when they see some of the advanced metrics that are coming out, like there are many different companies and analytics providers that are producing them, they all come up with this one sort of proprietary number to saying that this is the index that you must be using. And if it doesn't align with the way that a coach or a scout or a technical director sees the game, they're kind of like, no, I don't trust that one. Yeah. But if you have the opportunity to actually sit down with them, listen to the way that they actually want to communicate and measure football, and understand that nuance from one club to another, that goes a really long way to getting their buy into the analysis, but also giving them analysis that's fit for them. Because again, the way that one player is going to be fit for one club is going to be very different to the way that it is for another club. Yeah. And while the best players will always sort of ring true in terms of coming out with the best ratings and so on, there's still a very big difference as to how it's going to be applied within the way that they're trying to play football.
So in traditional scouting, the way it would done in the past, you'd have a man wearing a big jacket would drive and get money off his petrol per mile, whatever, to go to, say, watch a League 2 game, because they've heard there's a centre-back that could be quite a decent player, and he knows people who knows him.
This is your dream, isn't it, JJ?
Absolutely not.
To live on the motorway.
Well, that book, The Nowhere Men, that Mike Calvin wrote, is brilliant if anyone is interested in reading about scouting. But so, see, this is the traditional thing. You go, you drive out and you go and see a player play at League 2, and then if you just knew, if you're good at this sort of thing, you'd be able to work out this player, I think he could do a job in the Premier League with a little bit of this or that. Can data do the same thing now? Like, can you identify those same people? Because you're looking for value, right? The whole time you're in recruitment, you're always looking for value.
Good question. I think what you're looking for more so than value is transparency and understanding what they're doing. So if you're looking at the way that a scout traditionally has gone to a match and given a subjective appraisal on a player, the first thing that's limited in that is that you're only looking at one match. So a player will play 40, 50, 60 matches a season. And if a scout's doing their job, or if a club's doing their job, they're going to watch them many times, but even that many times might look like 10 or 15, and that's not indicative of the full sample of the 40, 50, 60 games that they've played. So
I really wanted the Roy of the Rovers answer here.
So effectively what's happening is subjective scouting. That's really important, and I'll get to that one in a second. But basically what data can do is making sure that you're looking at a whole profile of a player's performance in terms of the breadth of every match that they've played and how they've performed consistently over the course of, say, a season or whatever the sample size needs to be. But what we're doing with data and the way that it's being used probably across the industry broadly at the moment is using statistics. And what statistics are is basically what some of the data providers are capturing. So there's dribbles, there's successful dribbles, there's percentage of dribbles that are successful, and all these kinds of things. But each one of those different numbers in isolation can sometimes contradict one another in terms of which one is the right number to be using in different contexts.
What's an example of that?
Well, there might be a player that dribbles very often, and if you were to just look at his dribbling numbers, you might say, geez, he's a good dribbler, or he dribbles so much. But it's like, unless they're actually successful, or the amount of times that they're successful in doing it, or depending on which team that they're actually playing in, it's like relative to the amount of times they get on the ball, or relative to the amount of times they do these different attacking actions.
Depending on when and where they do it as well, I guess.
That's it. And the result of the dribble and what happens with the pass that follows it, there's so many different numbers that go into every skill across the pitch. But what we need to do is sort of cut through the noise of all these different numbers for dribbling and just create one number for dribbling.
Yeah.
And the way that we do that is we cluster and weight. We first of all benchmark what is actually good for that skill of dribbling, and each one of those different, say, 15 numbers that might measure it. And we're going to benchmark that relative to that player's specific position, whether they're, say, a fullback or a winger or a wing back. Yeah. There's going to be different context each time. But once we've added that context from a statistical point of view, what we can do is cluster and weight those numbers into one number for dribbling. And then there's going to be a different number for dribbling for each one of those different positions. And we're going to cluster and weight everything that's happening across the pitch in the same kind of way. So we've got all this language of what it means to have a player's different traits or metrics that go into that. So once we've got our plain language, so say dribbling, there's things like dribbling, crossing, assist that can all go into something like creating. And then at another level, there can be something like scoring, creating, passing, and defending, which can all go into an overall rating. So it's building this sort of tiered framework of all of the data that's available to us. and translate it into plain language. So when you look at that compared to this model of scouting subjectively, they're two very different things, where one is working off the eye and saying, this is what we know about a player based on my exposure to them. And there's a lot of things that you can capture with subjective scouting that you can't with data. But when you put the two of them over each other, they become quite a powerful tool. So if you're able to wrap that context into your analysis in terms of the way that you're interpreting the data points in the first place with all of that context and the appropriate benchmarking, then by the time you're actually bringing in the club's understanding of the way that they're trying to play football, you can come up with a pretty good profile as to how well a player is actually fit for a certain team or a certain formation.
And can I ask then, like, let's take the dribbling example. If you're a big Premier League team and you've got your own in-house data scientist and your own in-house scouts, I want to understand to what level of detail they're already doing some of these things. Yeah. So, for example, if they have identified that when a player on their team leaves in the coming transfer window, they're going to be losing, a fifth of their dribbles or successful dribbles from the previous season, and they want to replace that player like for like. When they look at like your dribble number, does that help them, or do they need to then look at the like specific number of successful dribbles? Like, are they recruiting already on the basis of like those individual statistics, or is it a lot broader than that?
It is a lot broader than that in terms of trying to, when you're looking at a player that's being replaced or someone that would come in to effectively play the same function within the team. Yeah. There's again so many different data points and so many different factors that go into that as well, like well beyond the numbers, like age profile and physicality and so on. But basically, when it comes to the dribbling example, what we can do is, first of all, if you're looking at this framework and knowing that at the top there's an overall rating as to how well a player is performing, what we can do is say, all right, first of all, which players where have the highest ratings overall? But then once we've filtered out, all right, which players are going to match that, fullbacks output or be around the certain level based on the age profile that we might be looking for or the leagues that they might be coming from, then we can start looking at their creativity score, and then we can, beyond that, start drilling down into their dribbling scores. And again, it gives you the ability to sort of filter these huge amounts of data points, like hundreds of data points that are getting fed into any one model, but in a very plain football language. So you can just ask about which ones are the best at dribbling in the way that we interpret dribbling, versus having each one of those numbers in isolation, where the alternative might be looking at something like a radar plot with, you might have each one of those different 15 numbers for dribbling. But when you look at that radar plot for just dribbling, that's effectively just a fraction of what that player is doing across the whole pitch compared to what can otherwise be measured. So going to this more advanced framework of pulling all of those numbers into this sort of tiered system of reducing all that information puts you in a much better position to understand it quickly, rather than going the other way around of having to drill down to all these different statistics, because statistics in isolation are effectively akin to what I would call like a highlights package of what a player does.
Sure.
If you were to show just this sort of 10, 11, 12, 13 statistics of what a player does, you can make any one player look better than another if you're to handpick which statistics you're choosing. So
it's great for me, rubbish for you, basically.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it sounds like looking at the Football Manager database, which I know some clubs in the past have used to level things down by searching at age, nationality, or like homegrown basis, and those sorts of parameters that they'd want to fit the profile player they're looking for. And then they have their own, I think they're a subjective scouting. So it's mostly, they have scouts who do decide that Alan St. Maximin's dribbling is 19, but his shooting is 10.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. So am I wrong to think that the sort of thing you're providing is a bit like a Football Manager player profile, but rather than based on subjective, it's based on what the data tells you it is, which the numbers would then adapt compared to, say I'm...
Based on you being a club.
Yeah, say I'm Chelsea and I'm looking for a winger and look at St. Maximin and I'm going like, oh, he's good at dribbling because that number's really high, but he can't shoot and he can't cross. So maybe not. But if I'm Aberdeen, I'd be like, oh my God, I've got to get this guy in because he's going to be amazing compared subjectively to the other teams in the league. Does that make sense? Am I right?
No, that does make sense. Yeah. So effectively what's happening is we're benchmarking players relative to the competition that they're playing in, and we're making sure that we're understanding how well those players are performing relative to what's expected of those competitions. Right. But in doing that, again, using data, what that does is that takes a lot of the labor-intensive work out of scouting, which, as we said before, you can't necessarily go and watch every single one of the 40, 50, 60 matches that a player is playing for every player that's out there.
Right? So this is what teams do now. This is the big first step in recruitment. So they have this base to then go from.
That's it. So I'd say that clubs who are doing it well are going to be data-driven and data-led in terms of knowing which players are roughly where in terms of how well they're performing through the data. But what the data is doing is it's delivering insights, not answers necessarily. So it's doing a lot of the heavy lifting of you in terms of understanding a player's profile and where their relative strengths and weaknesses. But that's where subjective scouting really comes into it. And that's really important that you can capture the nuance behind what's actually going into those numbers that can't be explained by numbers, or also doing these other things at looking at their physicality, their mentality, their just general approach to football that may, again, more or less align with the way that a club's valuing a footballer. So the data effectively is really good at doing a lot of the heavy lifting and understanding a player's technical profile, but there's still these other elements that go into scouting which data can't capture. So
would you assign a transfer value to them?
Sorry?
That come up, that sort of thing, like how much they should expect to be worth in the market?
It can be done, but that's a whole other art and science in terms of projecting a value. And I think it's an important distinction to make, though, where I think what a lot of people in analytics are doing are trying to actually come up with a value based on a projection of their future performance. But I think something that's almost been underutilized in the industry is profiling how they're going just here and now and looking at what we can objectively say, this is how they performed this season, or this is how they performed the season prior. There's a lot of people that are looking into the future to saying that they're worth this much based on this age profile. And that's where, as a science, football is really, really tough because there's so much context that you can't account for. Like you don't know what's going to happen in off the pitch that will affect or other players that is going to actually affect how they're going to perform later on. But what you do know really well is what they've just done. Mm-hmm. So being able to translate that into plain language in a way that people can just agree on, that doesn't have all this missing context or all this sort of nuance or things that can't be explained, is what gets buy-in to analytics with people in football clubs, because they can agree that it does work and have this objective conversation around it, knowing that that is going to give some really good insights and not necessarily answers on this player is the best player or that player is not going to be a good player. It's basically, it's economics. It's not maths in terms of giving you trends and going to help you make the right decision more often than not, as opposed to saying this player is categorically better than that player and that's going to be the answer. It's about making smarter and more informed decisions in a way that domain experts can understand and apply and trust that it's going to help guide that conversation.
So if I'm a club and I come to you, Dan, and I say I want a traits profile network built up for me and my team, and I know that what the profiles for each player looks like will be different for my team than it is for another team. Mm-hmm. How is it different? Like, what am I putting in? What's my input? And like, literally, how does that work? Yeah, that makes it different. What questions would you ask me at the beginning? Would we sit down and you say, "How do you want your team to play?"
Yeah,
or what's your football philosophy? How would you start the conversation?
Very good question. I'd start the conversation by asking what data they have access to.
Right.
So some clubs will have lots of data and work with all the primary data providers and have a massive amount of effectively resource to work with in that space. Other clubs will be working with one primary data provider. Other clubs might not have any data.
Sure.
So the first thing that I would say is, all right, what are we actually building our profiles out of? Because there's a big difference between having, say, Opta data versus having StatsBomb data. While they both are measuring similar things, there's sort of apples and oranges in terms of what they can both deliver that might be different to one another.
Okay. Let's assume I have all the data.
Okay, so if you have all the data,
that sounds right, doesn't it? That I would have all the data.
Yeah. Sounds good. So if you've got all the data, that's great. That makes for better modeling.
It makes Dan happy. Good.
Yeah, okay. That's it. So effectively, what would be happening to begin with is, all right, saying good to know that this is the data that we've got to work with. That's giving us a really good foundation to build some quality traits profiles off.
Yeah.
So the first thing that's happening is I'll probably provide a few examples of like, here is what a traits profile is more broadly, and I'll say here is how we can apply it. But how do you want to change this and tailor this in terms of the language and framework, first of all, in line with the way that you're communicating football at the club? Mm-hmm. So some clubs might call it passing, some might call it distribution, and so on. So we're actually just capturing that language, and then the different things that will go into it as well. We're basically going to measure each of the different elements that go into passing, each of the different elements that go into creating, each of the different elements that go into defending.
And my data team or tactics coaching team would help you decide which ones we care about the most. That's how it would impact the profiles.
Yeah, correct. So we're basically saying, all right, what is it that you want measured, or how do you want to profile a footballer? And this is the data that we're going to fill it in afterwards. But once you've got that subjective framework in terms of the way that they're communicating football, what I'll go away and do is basically quantify it with what would be the optimal ratings based on the sort of advanced maths that goes into the modeling in terms of what's going to be more or less aligned with conventional wisdom in terms of how those numbers correlate with one another.
Yeah.
And once we've got the optimal rating, it's then producing the outputs for the club and saying, all right, here's how all the ratings come out for all the players everywhere. Does it align with the way that you actually view football and view these players? And more often than not, it should be pretty much exactly where it needs to be. But if they want to then change that as well, they can adjust that in line with their intrinsic values of saying, no, we actually prefer our wingers to have a little bit more of this and a little bit less of that. But
it's kind of like a personality test in a way, isn't it? This is who you are based on your answers. Like, oh, I'm boring. Let's have faster wingers. Let's change our philosophy on the basis. That's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. And so can I just ask, let's say I was, you finished.
While we're on it, actually, hopefully we can edit that a little bit afterwards. But
that's fine, don't worry.
Basically, while we're on it, really good that you bring that up, because in terms of the PhD in human resource analytics that I've done, the science behind a lot of it is around personality profiling, hence the name traits, which is typically done in like the School of Psychology.
Sure.
So it's basically taking what is best practice from that academic setting and applying it to football. Mm-hmm. And again, that was done in Aussie Rules football to begin with, and then applying it to global football. But if you look at the way that the analysis actually comes out, it is almost like one of those personality traits profiles, but it's a football traits profile.
Okay, that sounds fun. So if I am, let's say, Liverpool and Man City, who are different teams, I understand they're different, JJ, before you tell me that they are, but they're both very successful. They're both looking for the same kind of caliber of player, let's say, that at least they're shopping in similar markets. If you were to do like a traits profile for both of those teams, how different do you think they would be? Could they end up being exactly the same?
No, they wouldn't end up being exactly the same.
That would never be the case.
No, I'd hope not. Unless they're all the people who are sitting around the room and having those different conversations come to the exact same conclusion of how the exact same statistics are being fed into the exact same model with the same language. I'd like to think that you can have 1,000 traits profiles across 1,000 clubs, and they're going to come out different each time. But effectively, again, what will happen is the same players will come out with the better ratings more often than not because they're good footballers, but the way the actual ratings are going to come out are going to be nuanced and different from one club to the next based on what it is that they're asking that player to do. So
if it was like the difference between Man City and Burnley, for example, then a striker who would play a very different role in both of those teams would have a very different rating in their profile, in their traits profile, but most of the time it wouldn't be like that. I'm trying to think of the most extreme difference I can.
No, yes is the answer to that one. And again,
how big would the difference be? 40 points? What is it out of 100 points? 1,000?
Yeah. Well, it's all relative again. So the way that traits works is, again, it's all relative, and you can pick whatever scale you want. So whether you want that to be a scale of 0 to 5, 0 to 10, 0 to 100, 50 to 100.
0 to 20 like in Football Manager? 0 to 99 like in FIFA?
Do you know, I'm doing this film club with my friend, and we decided to, it's only just for fun, not for anything else, but we decided to rate them out of 100, and it's changed my life.
Yeah.
Ratings out of 100 are amazing. I don't know why I've never thought to do that before with things. 10 is rubbish. 5's even worse. 100. You get a 67 out of 100. It feels very meaningful. You know what I'm saying?
Slightly above average.
Yeah. I think I'd choose out of 100 if I was at a club. Yeah.
And would you say 50 being the average or 75 being the average? Because if you're saying that a player is a 36, we should sign them. That's
Because it's like in FIFA, it feels like 60 is the average.
I'd say 70.
70 is the average in FIFA, is it? Okay. Yeah, I don't know. No, this is too many questions for me now. This is why I'm not in charge of a football team.
But they matter in terms of actually getting people to buy into the analysis. Right. If you're trying to say the same player could have a 2 out of 5, a 40 out of 100, and a 70 out of 50 to 100 as well, and they're all the same number or the same distribution, but people will interpret those very differently. So again, if you can put it in line with the way that people want to understand football, whether it's Football Manager, FIFA, or real life scouting, that rating scale matters.
This is a good point, because so now I think of it on the FIFA rating scale, if we think about 70 as average, I couldn't be on the scale, right, as a rubbish amateur football. I couldn't even get 1 in everything because it's weighted specifically for professional football players, right? Is that what I understand? Does that make sense, my question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Is that it? Yes,
I'm
you
just
are.
checking. I understand. Yeah. Fine. Okay. What kind of resistance do you come up against, I suppose, is an interesting question. Like, is it, I mean, I would imagine that like lots of resistance to to data in football would come from like more traditional football-y people. But based on the premise of your thing, which is like it helps everybody understand, or it's accessible in a way that other things aren't necessarily, I would imagine that probably isn't as much of a hurdle as it has been in the past.
Yeah. I'd definitely say that it's not as much of a hurdle because, again, it's reducing it down to plain language and people can understand it sort of first and foremost when they're looking at a tool or an output. But I think the resistance probably still comes from this understanding of not imposing data on people, but actually bringing them on this journey of saying, here's how statistics work, here's how metrics are different when we can wrap in all this context, and here's why we need to value the analysis. And there's still resistance from people because I think people who have sort of bought into data and other people that are advocating it within clubs, there is still this degree of skepticism and reluctance from some domain experts that are like, I'm not quite sure about that. And naturally they've got this sort of guard up and they don't want to.
Do they tend to be, without generalizing or anything, do the ones who tend to accept the data, are they younger? Or
are they American? So like the owners of teams and stuff, I suppose.
I'm trying to work out, it would be a younger thing, just you're more au fait with like seeing things. I think video games come into it for me. Or is there, that doesn't really matter, and it's people who, if they're working in a club in recruitment or anywhere and they've got resistance, is it because they've been involved in the game heavily and so therefore they know because that's it? Yeah. Is that what happens?
Yeah, very good question. I think like it's a generalization, but I think some of the younger people who've grown up playing FIFA and Football Manager, like the younger scouts, let's say, they're the ones who they don't need convincing of the data because they see the value and merit in it. But I think the application of data is only, or the value of data is only as good as the application in which it's actually being used within a club. And the decision makers are the ones who need to actually understand how to use it. So if you can find a way to actually bridge that gap and help them see the value, that's when it's actually going to make a meaningful difference within an organization. We're past the tipping
point now, though, aren't we? Because there's so many examples of teams that have like utilized or applied data well and become very successful as a result of it. Like if you're an owner of a football team in England, it kind of regardless of which professional level you're at, you can't ignore it because you look at the success of, I don't know, a club like Brentford or like what's happened with Liverpool being, at the elite level. There's sort of no way around it, is there?
Yeah, no, I think so.
Do you not put your phone on silent, JJ? It's very embarrassing, isn't it, that? On a podcast, a professional podcaster.
It's on airplane mode.
Is it?
Yeah.
Was it your phone, Dan?
That was mine.
Mine's on airplane mode too.
Was it yours?
No, it wasn't mine.
You sure?
Was it your iPad? No, it doesn't matter anyway. Carry on, Dan.
No, back to it then. The idea of data being like in football, hopefully everyone has started to accept that it is the way forward in just needing to be a piece of that puzzle. And I think people are all understanding that we need to use data. And there's these examples of your Brentfords and Liverpools where it's obviously being done well, but culturally it's a part of the way that those organizations are run. So that's where we ultimately need to get to. But one of the issues that I keep coming across in my work recently is that there's a lot of clubs out there now who have data but don't know how to use it. And they're basically saying, look, we got all this data. All these other clubs are doing it and it's working for them, but like how...
It costs us all this money, by the
way. How do we use this data? It actually, if you don't know how to interpret the data, it can actually get trickier and actually just make things harder.
Come in.
Yes.
Yeah, fine, okay.
Actually, so it's music to my ears every time they say, look, we've got all this data and we just don't know how to make sense of it. And sometimes they even get, data scientists and all these other people who are effectively digging deeper and making more and more numbers. But what we need to do is actually sort of take a step back and translate that into that domain language in such a way where they're like, all right, I understand the data. And once you've got them on board in terms of valuing what it can offer, they see the power and the way in which it can help them just make better decisions. And then it's moving forward, digging deeper once you've actually got the sort of cultural buy-in.
You're like a Rosetta Stone, but for numbers. That's what it feels like, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, if I was a football club, I'd probably get it,
Yeah, I think so. If you think there's lots of clubs, I'm thinking in Scotland particularly, from what little I know of it, is that they've generally had a scouting team of scouts and they've had access to Y-Scout and things like that. So
scouting team of scouts?
Yes, the recruitment team of scouts. Yeah. And they'll have a data analyst now, maybe one. I don't know how much these things cost, but obviously everyone's looking for value in the transfer market. Equally, clubs looking for value in the staff that they bring in. So if they've had this team of scouts and they're having to send them away for little trips, that's changed over the last maybe 15 years, where they're then using things like Y-Scout to be able to watch players that they can identify. But I don't think all of them are many of them are using this sort of thing. Like I know in the past, like some have been using Football Manager, genuinely the database, to try and identify players. But then this is the thing that you'd have, rather than having scouts going around doing this, you'd have this tool at any level, depending on what it costs, without a measured response in which you say, it depends. Does it cost a lot for like a club like Aberdeen or, I don't know, Cowdenbeath or something like that?
Yeah, good question. The short answer is no, really. I think that in terms of what I do, I'm helping translate that information. So that's not the cost. I think the primary cost is actually the data provider itself and subscribing to a number of different competitions feeds based on what it is that you want. But what I'm doing is really sort of this piece on top of it and saying, all right, you've got this data now, let's actually help them use it. So no, in that sense, I think what I'm doing is sort of being a data scientist, or again, that translator, but at scale, and helping clubs doing that in their own way, so that they've got that information that's fit for them, rather than being in this position where it's like, we've got all this data, but what now? Yeah.
Dan is like a real life version of that option in Football Manager where you can mask all the attributes until you scouted them all. So then you hire Dan
to unmask,
and then you know who the players are.
Yeah.
The data coverage in sport is getting richer and richer and deeper. So previously, this was something that was really limited to the Premier League clubs or the big Premier League clubs and top 5 clubs around Europe and so on who had access to this data. We're going back, 10, 15 years at this point. But recently, in the last sort of 3 or 4 years since I've been working in football, I've seen that more and more data is becoming available to clubs, and the ones who are becoming privy to it, you can see like your Forest Green Rovers in League 2 and so on, they're starting to use the data down at those levels, and it's having a material impact. But then if you're looking at the data that's actually being collected, there's now good quality data coverage at a national league level. But if that's happening at national league and it can happen in the equivalent leagues all across the globe, the power of data analysis is getting richer and richer as time goes on. So I'm very excited to see where it will actually get to as that continues to evolve and develop. But yeah, to answer the question about Aberdeen, it's like there's applications in any professional football club right now, but I think that probably might not have been true 5 or 10 years ago. But in 5 or 10 years' time, I think there'll be these kinds of opportunities for everyone out there to help them make a lot more of their finite resource.
Is it still humans collecting data? Like, is it still humans typing in the number of passes? And are there any robots that do this now?
Yes, it's still humans, but yes, there are robots that do it as well now. So I think that's going to be one of the monumental shifts that you'll see in the very soon, or if it's not already happening, it's happening soon. So there's different companies that are starting to get the automated tracking under control. And as that sort of becomes more reliable, that's going to cause this huge explosion of data. And
should make it cheaper as well, shouldn't it?
Yeah. That's it. So
shame for all the data collectors.
Robots are pretty big, so they're pretty expensive to build.
Yeah, but once you've built them,
clunky.
It's fine, isn't
make
it?
The doors wider.
Do you work for the data providers? Do you? Our costs have gone down 95%, but it still costs the same. I'm just curious because I would have thought that will make a big difference to the what kind of data and where it is available as well, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, there are, well, still in the work that I do, I can still see some nations where only the top tier of football is being coded in terms of the data that's being collected manually, but in time it'll be first, second, third, fourth divisions everywhere will end up having the same data that you can do this rich profiling on. So I think it's an exciting space where we're finally over this sort of like hurdle of the cultural acceptance that data's got a really important place in football, but moving forward, it's going to have more and more of an impact. But I think the amount of impact is really going to depend on the buy-in that the decision makers and domain experts can have to it. So I think that's the next sort of frontier of connecting data with football.
Great. Well, Dan Pelchen, thanks very much for joining us today. It was very interesting.
Thank you very much for having me.
JJ,
thank you.
If I've understood Dan correctly, I think he spent an hour saying that Erling Haaland is objectively the best player and all the stats, individual stats matter.
And that robots do exist in real life. They clonk around football clubs.
Covering football, yeah. Poor old Tom Warville. Right, there we go. Thanks for joining us today. We will be, I don't know when this is being released, but we'll be back at some point, I assume, unless one of us has died in the intervening time, which would be very sad.
Most likely me, I think.
I would have thought so. See ya.